Hello guys, my name is Tango Frown. Today I'm going to try to point out inaccuracies with Lazerpig's very old and irrelevant A-10 videos. I really meant to upload this before the whole current drama occurred with this particular YouTuber, but my audio in that video became corrupted, so I have to record it again. Also, please bear with me, this is my first video of this type, and I'm sorry about my poor microphone. Without further delay, let us begin.
Okay, I get it. I really do. The A-10 is everyone's favorite plane. I mean, how can you not respect this angry, grunting thing with its gigantic minigun, spewing a bullet bukkake all over the faces of everyone who dares get in the way of it, all while making the sound of a hippo with diarrhea? Or an angry warthog. Hence the name. Warthog, because Fairchild Republic A-10 shitting hippo doesn't sound nearly as cool. It is a plane adored by both its pilots and its fans worldwide, has been in service for almost 50 years, and there are currently no plans for its retirement. It has no equal in the world. Even its closest living rival, the Su-25 Frog, which was also built around a gun, has had to go through several very serious modernization programs to keep up with it, and with the Russian military budget being the way it is, so far only 7 aircraft have received this upgrade, though by the time I actually finish this video, an 8th might be finished. The rest are, well, stuck in the Cold War with that giant TV in the cockpit you have to aim with.
Alright, so the video begins with him introducing the fans of the A-10, kind of making fun of it and its fans. That's all fine and good. It's very true, it's a fan favorite aircraft. But then he goes and talks about its dreaded Russian counterpart, the infamous Su-25. He then says, since the Su-25 is a very old aircraft from the 80s, it has to be modernized to keep up with its counterpart, the A-10. He then says how the Russian military budget is so trash, they can only afford like 8 modernized Su-25s. This is not true at all. I believe the upgrade he's referring to is the Su-25 SM and SM3, as seen here in his video that he shows, which is supposed to be a more affordable variant, and this is reflected in its numbers. Around 80 or so were upgraded to SM status in 2020 when this video was uploaded. He then goes on to say that the rest of the Su-25s have to quote-unquote aim with this big camera, which really just shows that he doesn't fully really exactly know what he's talking about here. He's not too wrong, but this cockpit belongs to the Su-25TM, an upgrade to the Su-25T, which was a dedicated anti-tank guided weapon aircraft from the late 1990s. Only 8 of these TMs were built before it was cancelled. I believe this is where he got his 8 aircraft number from. However, there is some truth to this claim about mostly older aircraft. From what can be seen of Russian combat footage in the war against Ukraine, a large number of the aircraft serving with Russian aerospace forces are Su-25A models. This can be seen with the thing at the back, not seen on this SM3 variant here, and you can also easily tell by cockpit footage as well. Here you can see a lack of a modern KA-1-1-01 HUD, seen here, and a multi-function display, which is in the upgraded cockpit, but not the A model. So he is not completely wrong here. However, I think I should note that since the Su-25 is 100%, its only role in Ukraine is to launch rockets, mostly at a lofted artillery-like angle. And because of this role, I do not really think that a very large modernization package is needed. It certainly should be upgraded, but for this role it is very much fine as is. So then after this unnecessary nitpick, he then goes on to talk about why the A-10 was needed in the first place, and he goes on about some guy who had like nothing to do with it, or something like that, I don't know. But then he says this about the F-4 Phantom and its cast role in the Vietnam War.
Phantom just wasn't quite good enough at that secondary role. Because you have no clear target and there are friendlies nearby, you have to physically identify what it is you're shooting at. And if the ground team are in a panic because they're being shot at, or have lost the radio because they're being shot at, or have in any way no ability to clearly communicate to you, the pilot, probably because they're being shot at, then you could be circling for quite a while attempting to assess the situation, which is something the Phantom just couldn't do.
I disagree with what he's saying. And while it may seem like semantics because we arrive at the same conclusion, I feel it is important to point out. I believe this scenario is unrealistic because during the war, all CAS aircraft went through FAC. And I think the real reason why the F-4 was suboptimal in CAS was because it was much too fast and too unmaneuverable. After my little nitpick here, he goes on more and more about some German guy and some spray guy or something, and then talks about the development of the A-10. Now here's when he says some pretty controversial stuff. He talks about a live fire test which was designed to see how well the GAU-8 could kill Soviet tanks.
In 1979, a live fire test was initiated, the results of which you can read here, and I'll leave a link in the description since I really should be citing my sources for this shit. 10 M47 Patton tanks were placed in a rough triangle formation, mimicking that of a Soviet tank column during an assault. A single A-10 was deployed with the pilot making 10 passes, and allowed to fire as much ammunition as he wished. It was a clear day, the tanks were unmoving in an open terrain, and each one was fully combat loaded. God damn, it's almost like Burton commissioned this test. And the pilot was given sufficient time to come around into each pass at the best possible attack vector, effectively the ideal conditions as dictated by Fairchild Republic. And the results? During the test, the pilot fired off 174 rounds, making a single pass to attack each tank individually. Of those 174 rounds, 90 hit their targets, or 50%. Out of the 90 rounds which then hit their targets, 30 achieved penetration, 8 of the 10 tanks were actually hit, and 3 were destroyed, with the other 3 becoming immobilized. On closer inspection, it was revealed that of all the penetrating shots at each tank, that only 1 or 2 rounds were able to make lucky hits penetrating the fuel tanks or the ammunition, and all of those shots hitting the rear of the tank. It was considered that if all 3 tanks immobilized, all could be made operational again on the same day. It was also claimed that had these tanks been M60 Pattons instead of the highly outdated M47s, only 1 of the tanks would have been destroyed. And against the more modern Soviet T-62s, which share a very similar profile to the M47s, it was theorized that the GAU-8 would have been next to useless, especially considering in a real-life situation the Soviet tanks would be moving and deploying smoke, and with the A-10 only able to make a single pass. You see, in a Soviet tank column, the supporting heavy AAA units are typically concentrated to the rear. This was the case during the A-10's initial development, but by the time it was deployed, Russia had... I feel like I show this footage every video now. It's almost like the reformers forget this thing exists.
There's a lot to talk about here, so you have to bear with my shit-ass microphone. Thankfully, he links the source, and oh, yes, we will be looking at it. He first notes that the test is kind of unrealistic, which is true. He then says that 3 tanks were destroyed, which is technically correct, as he only counts what the paper refers to a K-kill, or total destruction of a tank, as an actual kill. But the results are actually a little more complex than that. This paper also mentions M kills from mobility and F kills for weapons kills, like the crew and such. And to see what tanks would have really died in combat, we'll look at the paper now. The first tank damaged was 28, and it was a mobility kill. It was hit in the engine, which caused it to lose oil, rendering it completely immobilized. Hypothetically, it can still fight, but it cannot move. The second tank damaged was 41, and it was a mobility and weapons kill. The engine was hit and the turret was perforated, killing the commander, gunner, and loader. In a real combat scenario, this tank is dead and no longer fighting. The third tank killed was number 47, which caught fire after being hit and is dead too, a K kill, completely destroyed. The fourth tank killed was number 30, which blew up immediately after the attack, another K kill. The fifth tank killed was number 48, which killed everyone inside. This tank is most likely dead too. The sixth tank damaged was number 33, which was hit in the fuel tank, causing a mobility kill. Again, this tank can fight, but it cannot move. The seventh hit was number 38. It was slightly damaged in the tracks, but was also hit in the gun barrel, which probably means it can no longer fire its main cannons without repairs, becoming much less combat effective. The eighth tank damaged was number 39, and most of its crew was killed and its engine caught on fire and could not be extinguished, leading to its K kill. He then goes on to say that against real T-62s, it is theorized that the GAU-8 would have been useless, but I didn't see this anywhere in the paper. I saw the exact opposite. I guess he's talking about somebody else who theorized that, but he should have clarified that. Then he says that Soviet evasive maneuvers with their tanks, popping smoke and such, could nullify the A-10's effect of its gun. He also says that Soviet SHORAD, like the Tunguska, could move with these tanks and destroy any attacking aircraft. I do kind of agree with this. Of course, it would have been much harder than this test if the Soviet tanks were actually moving and popping smoke and doing all that sort of shit. However, I do think if this was a real attack against a Soviet armored formation with no anti-air cover, the tanks would have been destroyed either way. Maybe not all of them as badly, but even if only, let's say, a quarter of them were damaged or destroyed, that would still be a successful attack in my opinion. And this would be only with its gun too, which is not very realistic. He also mentions that against deadly Soviet anti-air vehicles like the Tunguska, the A-10 would not have been effective in destroying the formations, as seen in the test. And while I do think that these SHORAD systems would have been highly dangerous to the A-10, there is some evidence that suggests that the A-10 could fight against some air defense, as seen here in a report about Desert Storm. Also, remember that he is praising Soviet technology here. You're going to want to remember that for later.
When the 1979 live fire test came out, interest in the A-10 began to dry out faster than Ben Shapiro's wife's vagina. There's also considerable issues with the structural stability of the aircraft. During stress testing, the frame began to develop some serious fatigue flaws. It was an easy fix, but shortly after, large cracks began to develop along the wing struts. Afterwards, fatigue issues continued to be a bit of a problem, and the aircraft was partially redesigned with a thicker outer skin. But by then, the damage was done. The reformers began to distance themselves from the aircraft, and international interest in sales of the A-10 dropped to zero. Even Sweden, which had been looking into creating their own version of the A-10, cancelled the program before it could get off the ground.
Okay, sisters, let's unpack this. First, he claims that because of this live fire test, which actually proves that the gun by itself is effective against Soviet tanks, that other countries do not want to buy it. I could not find anything that corroborated this claim. I think I know the real reason why other countries didn't buy it, and I'll explain that to you later. Secondly, he talks about the A-10's early structural issues, and all he says regarding this is pretty okay. And it should also be noted that many thin-skin A-10s were used in combat, but I still do not see anything here that would make other nations not want to purchase the A-10. He then goes and talks about Saab's esoteric proposed A-10 variant, and I don't really blame him for being wrong here, because it took me a while to find anything on this. But from what I can gather, this was a proposed competitor to replace the Swedish Viggen in the ground attack role. It never got past the drawing board and was forgotten in favor of the Saab 38, which made it to the mock-up stage before being abandoned completely in favor of the famous Gripen. It's also kind of irrelevant, but the F-111 that Lazerpig just loves so much also had some similar issues like this when it was first introduced into service.
At this point, even Congress was starting to ask questions. The Army was completing their attack helicopter program, and though the Cheyenne would eventually be cancelled due to the massive gaping flaws in its design, the Apache would rise from its ashes. The Marines had also just purchased the British Harrier jump jet, one of the first and only times America would purchase a foreign design. Congress now wanted to know why the Air Force needed a third close air support aircraft. The Air Force dug in their heels. They needed something that could slug it out up close and personal with anything on the ground in an environment where return fire was a guarantee. Also, there was some politics over funding and what have you, but we don't have time to get into that. The Congress relented, but after yet more tests on the A-10's wear and fatigue, production halted in 1984. It seemed like the A-10 was gearing up to be a failure. And then, in 1991, freedom happened. The 1991 Gulf War is the single most successful military campaign in modern history. The Iraqi army was well trained, well armed, and they were the fourth largest army in the world with about 4,000 tanks. They presented a formidable foe. And right off the bat, as the build-up to the war began, the comparisons to Vietnam.
Alright, I skipped ahead quite a bit. It goes on about the Gulf War and such, talks about the reformers trying to spin it their way or whatever. I'm just gonna cut to when he talks about the A-10 again. Also, you suck at word game, dude. 1v1 me, I'll kick you. Okay, he doesn't talk about the A-10 in this video anymore, so let's go to part 2.
My main source for all of this is this 1993 study which detailed the use and effectiveness of every single weapon used in the Gulf War, including this very large section on the A-10. Link in the description, even though I know no one's going to read it.
Don't you worry, bro. We're gonna be reading it.
The 93 report basically confirms what I'm calling the Lazerpig loop. Since we all get to name something after us that probably exists already, shut up! I'm calling it the Lazerpig loop, okay? I want a thing! People think Soviet shit is best because rugged, battle-hardened. Soviets don't have Pentagon. Sorry, let me do that line again. People think Soviets don't have Pentagon-level corruption. People don't think that the Russians are corrupt. So people don't think the Russians are corrupt. And they're all patriots. So war happens, Soviet shit turns out to be shit, people forget war, Russia strong memes, and then we're back to square one. I'll leave that for a different video just to get you hyped up about it for when I finally make it in like a couple of months or whatever. When I do a fully unqualified analysis of the T-14 and annoy some Russian people. And then I'll get angry comments like, "You're not real, man. My grandmother once beat head off Nazi tank." Then
Does the 93 report really confirm all that, though? From what isn't censored, it sort of implies that the Iraqis did so poorly because of their incompetence, not because of their equipment. I could also say that in your first vid, you were actually praising Soviet anti-air like the Tunguska. Or I could say that Soviet-built Iraqi SAMs performed well compared to other units of the Iraqi military. Or that Soviet equipment has been showed to be able to go toe-to-toe with Western equipment in several other conflicts, but fuck it, here's my little tango loop.
I'm going to break down the aircraft's performance into 3 segments, since it is quite complicated. We're going to talk about its survivability, its performance as a tank hunter, and its performance as a close air support vehicle. You can tell that I am absolutely off my fucking tits, can't you? I'm very drunk. You cannot do this sober. I'm sorry. I'm gonna do all these in reverse order since it's more fun. Right, so in terms of close air support, there isn't really much in the way of statistics, as none are ever really taken, because the US for some reason doesn't think that that's important. So comments on the A-10's capability as a close air support weapon is taken mostly from the experiences of many US and British infantry and that one Canadian guy who called for air support and found an A-10 was being sent their way. Now, fighting enemy entrenched infantry, the A-10 should be perfect for this task. It's got a giant cannon on it. You know, it's a 30mm cannon that'll rip through anything. You know, cement, cardboard, people, dogs, nothing, absolutely nothing can stand up to that. Doesn't matter how many dogs you strap to yourself, that thing is going to kill you. So, why do almost all of the vets I've talked to who have experienced an A-10 coming to aid them fucking hate it?
Are you gonna show somebody saying that, or are you gonna just say that and we're supposed to believe you?
Now, I should point out, a lot of vets do in fact love it, but there is a striking difference between people who have experienced it as a ground attack aircraft, you know, shooting at things from a safe distance away, and those who've had it down upon them, attacking targets mere meters away. The reason for that discrepancy is that cannon is not very accurate. In ideal circumstances, Fairchild consider any shot landing within 12 meters of where the pilot was aiming as accurate, of which the A-10 can land about 80% of its shots, accurately. In less than ideal conditions, I've been informed ballpark numbers are anywhere between 50 to 20%. I mean, that depends who you talk to, really. Apparently, it's got a lot to do with the vibrations from the gun. It causes the entire plane to wiggle around and can throw off your accuracy if you're going too slow. That's why they tend to fire in little short bursts. It's also got a lot to do with your angle of attack and everything. I don't know. An A-10 pilot tried to explain all this to me in Discord, and about 4 hours later, I wanted to die. Here's the thing, even in ideal circumstances, which never happen on a battlefield, 12 meters average is a big distance. That's a bus. That's a whole freaking bus. So between you and the enemy, whatever the A-10 decides to target, you have a radius of buses, which we shall call the splash zone. And about 20% of the several thousand rounds the A-10 will fire is going to land outside of that, where you are. This puts you in something which we in the sciences like to call an awkward position. For example, if you're taking fire from a building and your men are taking cover outside and you call for air support, if an A-10 shows up, you are within the splash zone, unless it's like a really tall building. In March of 2003, a friendly fire incident involving the US Marines depicted this exact scenario. The Marines, under heavy fire, called for air support and 2 A-10 showed up and liberally applied bullets to the infected area, killing 10 Marines and wounding a further 17.
I wish you would specify exactly which friendly fire incident this is, but I believe he's talking about the incident which took place on the 23rd March of 2003. And of course, it is not nearly as cut and dry as Lazerpig would like you to believe. First of all, he's implying here that the Marines were sitting outside of a building. They called in an airstrike on said building, and the A-10s that were tasked to hit it missed the building and hit them, but this is not really what happened at all. This event occurred during the Battle of Nasiriyah, and according to this CENTCOM report, this is what really went down. A FAC identified his grouping as the lead friendly element while calling in an airstrike, and cleared 2 A-10s to attack anything to his north. This was false, and the 2 A-10s ended up firing upon friendly units ahead of the air controller. Not only that, but friendly forces were also allegedly hit by AGM-65 Maverick missiles, not just a gun as he says here. So in short, the A-10s fired upon friendly troops and vehicles that they were told were hostile. A very common friendly fire scenario that is of course not only committed by the A-10.
In 2015, declassified reports obtained by USA Today showed that the A-10 had killed more friendlies and civilians than any other US aircraft in blue-on-blue incidents. And keep in mind, reports on accidental civilian deaths only began in 2010, when the A-10 is being used, a lot less than it used to be. We'll get to that in a minute. What this means for infantry is when the A-10 shows up, your squad has to take cover. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgent forces had learned to spot when US forces would start taking cover and would promptly do the same. The A-10 would fly in, perform its run, and once it was over, the insurgents would emerge from cover having taken very few losses.
This is true, but not how Lazerpig would like you to believe. Whenever there's a friendly airstrike, artillery strike, GBU strike, it is pretty often that troops will take cover. I don't know if that thing is true about insurgents, it probably is true, but this would be true for all forms of fire support, not just an A-10 run.
And as a result of complaints, A-10s now began to carry cluster bombs and hydro rocket pods in order to supplement the cannon, or use in place of it, something Pierre Spray said it would never need to do. Now the problem here is exactly what defines a close air support mission. By its very nature, it is an undefinable mission. Someone is under heavy fire, they have called for air support. That's it. When air support arrive, they generally have very little information and could be facing anything, from a group of infantry spread out over a wide area taking cover in buildings and ruins or rubble, to entrenched infantry supported by armoured units, to a tank, to people in Toyota Hiluxes driving around in circles firing 50 cals, to a fucking monster.
I don't think this is very true. The aircraft should be controlled by an air controller, which should be informing them of what type of target they will be engaging, where it is, all of that.
Whatever shows up has to be equipped to deal with whatever it may find, with the expectation that information from the ground team may be limited, as, and I cannot stress this enough, people under fire get stressed. Stressed people are not a reliable source of information, especially if they are green. This is why the A-10 has more than just the fucking gun. This is why Burton's Blitzfighter design would have never worked in this role. That's why, in spite of all Spray's whining, the A-10 carries bombs and missiles and rocket pods and extra cannons, and why it was originally equipped with infrared laser-guided missiles, so infantry on the ground could use laser detonators to guide the A-10's bombs onto targets that they could see that the pilots might not. And all of this would have been obvious if you just shut your fucking mouth and think for a fucking minute. This is the biggest problem with the A-10. While it is designed for close air support, its main weapon is also its biggest liability in most situations it can expect to encounter, and the pilots want to use it and have blatantly admitted to overusing it even in situations where it was not required. But, I understand it's better to waste ammo and save lives than, conserve ammo and see someone die. But this is coupled with the second point, and it's a doozy. It's a doozy. You see, the situational awareness of the A-10 is bad. Very bad. So bad, in fact, pilots during the Gulf War were using binoculars to try and identify targets.
Well, so did the F-18, so is it really that big of a problem?
We need to talk about something else now, because people mention this fuck all the time, okay? Speaking to a number of US veterans, I was told the story of a blue-on-blue incident during the Iraqi War. And if you don't know this story, tuck yourselves in, because it's a big one. The story goes that an A-10 spotted a column of tanks advancing and dived to attack them. The problem being that they were British scimitar tanks, light recon vehicles made out of aluminium, very squishy. The A-10 managed to destroy 2 tanks and a supporting engineer vehicle before he received a radio call informing he was firing on friendly troops.
Pop-off, 35, 93, 4, go. Roger, pop-off. Hey, be advised that in the 3122 and 3222 group box, you have friendly armor in the area, yellow small armored tanks, just be advised. Yes, shit! Got the smoke. Hey, pop-off 3-4, aboard your mission. You've got, looks like we may have a blue-on-blue situation. Alright. God bless it!
One soldier was killed, and had the A-10 arrived moments later, the death toll would have been considerably more political, as the tanks had stopped due to a number of civilians, including children, and began advancing towards them from a nearby town. The Brits in Iraq found that friendly fire incidents and close calls from American units, especially A-10s, were quite frequent, and supposedly there was a request from British High Command in Iraq to stop A-10s from being used in British zones. The cockpit footage was released in 2007 and makes for somewhat grisly viewing. You can even hear the pilot vomiting once he learns he's fired on friendly units.
I'm gonna be sick.
But before that, the moments leading up to the incident, the A-10 spots the vehicles and tries to confirm or not if they are friendly. He's not using any of the electronic systems that could confirm if or not they are, because he doesn't have any. He's going purely on visual identifiers, large orange panels marking collision vehicles, as well as the flags and distinctive markings, none of which you could make out clearly in the several minutes he was circling the convoy, mistaking the orange panels for rocket launchers.
This is, of course, not the full story. The A-10s that did spot the unidentified vehicles did in fact ask if they could be friendlies, to which the ground controller responds, "That is an affirm. You are well clear of friendlies," a very similar scenario to the one we covered before, where the ground controller gave incorrect information to the attacking aircraft. He then goes on about the A-10A's lack of targeting pod equipment, which if was had here, may have prevented the tragedy. And while this might have been the case, let's look at some other examples where the offending unit had some state-of-the-art electronics to tell friend from foe. In '91, an Apache fired upon 2 US vehicles it believed were hostile, due to friendly ground forces reporting enemy vehicle sightings in the area. Despite its decent thermal displays, it fired anyway. On December 5, 2006, a US Navy F-18 strafed Royal Marines on accident, killing 1. On the 23rd of August, 2007, an F-15E with good sensors dropped a bomb on British troops, possibly because of poor coordination with an air controller on the ground. The last one I will talk about right now is a friendly fire incident which occurred on April 6, 2003 that involved an F-14B Tomcat. Now I would really like to talk about this one because it shows that despite having some of the best sensors, these mistakes can still be made. The F-14 was upgraded with the Lantern pod, and it was considered very effective compared to other aircraft's targeting pods due to the TID here. The screen which the RIO looked at to identify targets and such had very high resolution. We could see farther and clearer than other aircraft. Despite this, one F-14 still dropped a laser-guided bomb on a friendly convoy, killing over 20 because of poor coordination with a stressed forward air controller.